People often ask me, why did you write? And to answer them, I often quote from the great American writer, James Weldon Johnson. He said, a people may become great through many means, but there is one measure by which its greatness is recognized and acknowledged. The final measure of the greatness of all peoples is the amount and the standard of literature and art that they have produced. The world does not know that a people is great until that people produces great literature and art. No people that has ever produced great literature and art has ever been looked upon by the world as distinctly inferior. James Weldon Johnson. All the more reason why I appreciate people like David Ambrose in Grenada, who is doing human work, bringing authors together and publicizing the books written by Grenadians. We have to tell our own story. For if we do not tell our story, others will continue to tell our stories for us. We think of the Kalinago and the Galilee. People call them Caribs, although they never call themselves Caribs. I wish I could have read some story that they wrote, because they didn't have the capability of putting things into print. So much of what we know about them is what they told us. All the more reason why we should write. Tell we stories. Now, I love writing since I was a little child. I often use Grenadian terms. So I would say since I was a young gospel. English composition and English literature, they were favorite subjects of mine. I won a prize in a competition that was held among secondary school children in Grenada during the early 70s. That's when I attended the St. John's Christian Secondary School. The topic dealt with CARIFTA, Caribbean Free Trade Association. I remember the day I had to go to Prime Minister's residence, that's Prime Minister Eric Matthew Gary at Mount Royal, to receive a prize, which was a book. I don't know what became of that book. I shook Mr. Gary's hand before, as he used to visit my father when I lived in Manjaloo with my father. You see, they knew each other from the days spent in Aruba. Gary was in Aruba. My father and others were in Aruba also. And I remember Mr. Gary looking at me when he was a little boy, and he said, did you do GC yet? No, I didn't even go to secondary school, and he was asking if I did GC already. And then I saw him later on at Shaper School when Brother Melvin Shaper invited him to speak to the students. And I remember him saying that while he was in Aruba, he slept on books. So that meeting there at Mount Royal, when I shook his hand, was actually the second time since I spoke to Mr. Gary. Now, there were teachers who spotted the ability in me early, and this is why I would say to you who are teachers, when you spot something, some talent, some ability in a child, let the child know, encourage that child. I think of Sister Joan Ferreira, who taught at the St. John's Christian Secondary School. She used to read my essays to the class. And back then, I didn't have an inkling of no idea that I was going to write books in the future. And I think of a certain Mr. James Andrews of Caliste, who was once the headmaster of the St. George's boys secondary school, Catholic boys secondary school, and he taught there for a number of years. And he once told me, "You will be a brilliant writer one day." I remember that. I remember the words of Sister Joy Shaper, who taught English literature at St. John's Christian Secondary School. She told the class that once we should write, we decide to write as Grenadians, we should make use of local color. I remember that. She advised us to look around, make use of our senses when we write. I took her advice, and I've seen how that became so effective when I wrote about the breadfruit tree, etc. I always say that once the breadfruit tree gets the respect that the apple tree gets, we know we are going somewhere. I must mention a woman, Professor Breidenthal, who taught at Brooklyn College when I attended Brooklyn College. I had completed a 25-page paper on a man called Lee Walesa and the Polish Solidarity Movement. And that woman looked at me and said, "You write well. What country are you from?" I said, "I was from Grenada." She said, "Look, man, you write well." And those words were very, very inspiring. For some reason, I committed to memory what I saw while I was growing up in Grenada. I observed what I observed, I committed to memory. So when I saw old Mr. Marichaud, I often wrote about him on the sand of Pandy Beach in Grenada nearly 40, 50 years ago. He remained in my thoughts. I didn't know I was going to write about him later and put him in my books, but I did. Now, I was fortunate, while growing up in Grenada, to be exposed to the writings of the major English and American authors and poets. You see, I had the experience of reading writers from England, Shakespeare, etc., and American writers. I read of Blake and Frost and all those writers. So I had that experience. I was only 10 years old when I was reading the words of Longfellow, Wordsworth, Tennyson, Keats, and the writing of authors like Thomas Hardy. There was a book called The Royal Readers. It had poems like Longfellow, and those who wrote other poems. The Burial of Sir John Moore, Not a Drum Was Heard, Not a Funeral Note. And I was also exposed to some of the West Indian writers, but there were not many. And that is why I emphasize the point I made previously, that people like Mr. David Ambrose is doing a very, very good thing, encouraging Grenadians to write. Yes, there were not too many Caribbean writers, but the sprinkling that we are connected to, like Derek Walcott, V.S. Nightball, George Lamming, John Carew. I love Timothy Calendar's story, An Honest Thief. How many of you have read about An Honest Thief? One of the stories in a book called The Sun's Eye. You ever heard of The Sun's Eye? I like the piece by Derek Walcott titled As John to Patmos. The story Catching Crabs by George Lamming always remind me of my boyhood days in Grenada when I used to walk on the muddy track, Lagoon Road, now called Grenadian Boulevard, and I saw those little crabs, the little red crabs we call Tululu crabs. I must say once again, I began to write. Once I began to write with the intention of publishing, I've mentioned it before, I did not reread the works of those writers, for I wanted to develop my own distinct style and ideas. Always put into effect what God gave you. God gave you. You are special. Now, a West Indian who had a big effect on me was someone called G.C.H. Thomas. And there was another one, a Jamaican, who wrote in the 1940s, a man called Evan Jones. Now, G.C.H. Thomas wrote a book, Ruler in Hyruna, a very humorous book indeed. I like Evan Jones' Song of the Banana Man because of the he fused dialect with standard English, and I do that because we should not be ashamed of the words that evolved in our homeland over the years. We should not be ashamed of it. Talk it. The people out there would like to hear and to learn the meaning of those words that we speak. No, so I opted always for a mixture of the vernacular with standard English because it is my belief that it will have more international appeal. Yes, there are people out there who want to know about us. The colloquialism is the flavor, the spice that attracts people. Yesterday on the Bob Show, I mentioned Hurricane Ivan planast the Buchan that called our school at the St. John's Christian School, an old Buchan, an 18th century Buchan that became our school in the parish of St. John, Brothers to be exact, the place. And yes, I mentioned that Hurricane Ivan planast the school. There are people out there who would like to know what do we mean by planast. And my literary journey was strengthened, and we have to be open minds and to read various authors from various places. I read a work of American and African American writers during my college days. So there was influence from African American writers. The book I remember well, Black Writers of America, a comprehensive anthology. And the authors from the University of Illinois, Richard Barksdale and Kenneth Kinnaman, led from the Macmillan Company. And above was, I mentioned, the Black Writers of America, one of the African American books that we studied, many of us, in Brooklyn College. James Weldon Johnson, black writer, very good, prolific writer. Black Manhattan, I read that book. And what about Claude McKay, the Jamaican? Oh, I remember his words. I have this thing for literature. It sounds like music to my ear. The poems, the poetry. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while wronged us back the mad and hungry dogs, making a mock at our accused lot. Powerful words. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die. Mackay, Claude McKay. And Langston Hughes. The Negro speaks of rivers. I have known rivers. I have known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood veins. My soul has grown deep as the rivers. Langston Hughes. So I gained inspiration from reading those writers, and I wanted to aim, and actually I did, at my own artistic style. I write on inspiration. Some of you might see me on Facebook in the middle of the night writing, because that's when the inspiration comes sometimes. And if I say to myself, I'm going to write it in the morning. In the morning when you get up, it's gone. And if I don't feel it, I don't write it. So yes, many times I wake at nights and jump on the computer. Just to say it in our Grenadian way, jump on the computer when the inspiration strikes. It is on such occasions like those that I do not have to struggle to write, because the thoughts come freely. You feel inspired. And on dialect, because some people have a little problem with dialect, yeah? This I will say. It's a quotation. Dialect, as far as I am concerned, as a Grenadian, it is the most effective linguistic medium to articulate the pulse, the rhythm, the culture, and the beauty of Caribbean life. I have to include dialect that captures the mood and gives writing authenticity. You want to be authentic. So you use the words that were spoken and you don't polish it up and make people believe that it was said in that way, a different way. Finally, I have to big up. I like to use terms from the Caribbean. Big up the old Jamaican term. Mr. H.D. Baptiste, we used to call him Daddy Beaks, past head master of the Grenada Boys Secondary School, and he went and taught after a while at the Anglican High School. He actually offered me a job there because I sat in his class doing private lessons when Brother Shaper could not find a teacher to teach English at the A level at the St. John's Christian Secondary School. So Brother Shaper made arrangement for me to sit in Mr. Batiste's house and study for the English A-level examination. I often tell GBSS students, boy, you had Daddy Biggs, and he was teaching a class of 40, probably 50 people. But I had private lessons in the house of Mr. H.D. Baptiste. And finally, let me talk about Sister Joy Shaper, teacher at the St. John's Christian Secondary School. And I mentioned that before. She did tell us that when we write, look around us, look and see what is before us and write about it. Already we were studying about Frost and the poets, the Blake and the Hardy and the Tennyson, Longfellow, etc. But we too could write our own story. And we have to encourage our young ones coming up to write. So in memory of Sister Joy Shaper, past teacher of the St. John's Christian Secondary School, I penned those words, the words that I'm going to read to you today. Write, she urged us, write. Wake up your senses and write. Paint the pictures the world awaits. Observe the waves as they splash against the smoothened rocks. Write, my children, write. Listen as the raindrops touch petals, those cheerful angels in the wind. Stare at myriad glittering eyes twinkle in the Spice Island sky. Write, my students, write. Reveal the color of evening sun bowing in the horizon far, and flamboyant trees glowing on the hillside. Write, my children, write. Let the world inhale the spices, the Grenadian spices that rise from your pages. Write, my children, write. Let the world know that Tennyson, Dunbar, and Longfellow can spring from the tropical sand, and our words linger. Make use of local color. Write, my children, write. Anthony Wendell, lyrics. God bless. Brother and Sister Joy Shaper.